just waiting for our speaker. She is a mystery lady. She hopefully will be a surprise for you. When she comes, I'll introduce her. We're going to videotape this session, and I'll introduce her to you. Mr. Hughes, if she chooses to sit down, I guess there's no problem with that. So we'll say approximately here, I guess.
There were 4 kids, and then my parents. And my mom told us that there was going to be war, so we wondered what war was. It had not come into our vocabulary as yet at that young an age. And she said that the Germans wanted to take over our country, and they wanted to get rid of the Jewish people, and they and our parents said that we had to sort of watch out about things that were going on, but we were really too small. My older sister was 7, and then there was a sister in between 6, me 4, and then another little girl. And so the first year of the war, you heard very little about it. We just went to school as usual. I went to kindergarten, and everything seemed to be going normally. And then about a year later, the Germans started to come into our area, which is about in the middle of Holland, not too far from Utrecht, which is a city in the dead center of Holland, and that was about 70 kilometers away from us. And by the way, the little village where I lived was Nunspeet, Nunspeet, a very small village. Anyway, the Germans started to occupy part of our school, which meant that we could only go to school half of the time. We had to take turns with other kids. Say maybe the grade 4 to 6 had to go on Mondays, and we would go on Tuesdays. But when you're small, you adjust very easily to these situations, and so we just kept going to school. And then the Germans started to get into houses and farms as well, and they wanted our big house, and so
Mr. Farrell, contact the main office, please.
we had to
Mr.
get
Lennox
out of
Farrell,
our
contact
house,
the office.
and we had to look for some other place to live, and we ended up in a farmhouse outside the village. It was very different there because there were only a few farms, and they were very far apart. And there was lots of meadows and all the cattle there that you could think of. It was kind of exciting too, because we had never really been around the cows and the horses and the pigs, and we soon made friends with kids who lived in the farms. And we were having a wonderful time helping the farmer. We even ended up helping milk the cows, and in the fall bringing the hay into the house and get it into the attic, and it was just wonderful. Then they also started to occupy our friend's farm. They had a huge big farm, and part of her farm was occupied by the Germans, so they lived in one half of the farm, but they could still look after their cattle. And we were in our house, which was very different from the house we had before. It was the farmhouse, and the stable and the big place where they keep the animals, that in Holland that's all together in one building. And so in this house where we lived, we also had a stable, and we of course there were no animals there because it was kind of a run-down farmhouse where we lived. And in the stable my dad put a big carpet on the floor so that in the winter we could play in the stable and have our toys on that carpet, and that was okay. We had to go to school, still to the same school, but that was on the other side of the village, so we had to walk over an hour to get to school, and consequently we had to take lunch with us and eat at the school and then come home at night, and it was kind of tiring. We would come home, we would get a cup of tea or a glass of milk, and then there would be supper, and after supper we were quite sleepy, and usually we would be in bed by 7 o'clock, 7:30. Then one day my father came home and he was talking about the situation, about the Jews getting picked up and sent to concentration camps, and it really bothered him. And he got together with a group of friends and they decided that they would try and hide these Jewish people. So we ended up with a group of Jewish people in our house. And actually about every so often there would be a different group of people, and one group would go away again. And I presume that was for safety's sake, just have them in different places and not all the time in the same place. Now our farmhouse had an enormous lot around it. There were lots of fruit trees, and it had a big beech hedge around it. And just on the inside of the hedge, my dad and his friends dug trenches just in case somebody would come and catch these Jewish friends we had there, so that they could hide during the day. We took it for granted that these people slept somewhere in our house, but we never knew exactly where. Because in the morning we were up at 7, and these Jewish friends, some of them were teenagers and some of them were older, they would sit at the table and we would have breakfast with them. And as I say, at night we were early in bed, so we never realized where these people slept. And we didn't even question it. I guess way back in the 40s, we didn't question as much as the people do these days, and we weren't as observant either. So years later, we found out that my dad had also built something under the stable. They had opened up part of the floor, and they had been digging there and made places so that the Jewish people could sleep there. So that was their hiding place. But of course we weren't told. You can't tell a small child, because we did have quite often Germans visit us during the day or at night, and we were always questioned. Now it leaked out that my father was hiding Jews, so he had to be careful himself. And a lot of the time we didn't see him, and my mother would say in the morning, "Okay, kids, if somebody comes today and you're asked, where is your daddy today, you tell him he is in Amsterdam." We would never question why. We would just say, "Okay, Mom," and do as we were told. So a couple of times we had people come during the day, and now our beech hedge was quite low, and we had some kind of a little tower like you have here on the playgrounds, like a little monkey bar or something you could climb in, and then you could sit on the top and look out. Now from our property was a long path about half a mile long, and that led to a big road, a kind of a semi-highway. And my brothers especially, they would climb a lot on this tower, and if they saw anybody come, that was okay, but if they saw anybody come in uniform, they would always call my mother and say, "There's somebody in uniform coming," so that my mother could warn our Jewish friends, and they could hide in the trenches. Well, one day somebody came, and of course we were in school as well, so we didn't always sit in that little tower and watch out. And somebody was at the door before we realized. Now the people did get to hide into the trenches, and this guy went around the house and looked in the house, and did we have any Jewish people? And my dad wasn't home, and my mom said, "No, it's just me and the 4 children." And so just as they were leaving and looking around the property, one of the girls lifted her head a little bit to see whether these people had left yet. And so then they were caught. so that was really scary. They all had to come out of the trenches, and they were put against the wall, and there were these two soldiers, and well, I guess when you're small, you're just curious. You either, I guess, run away crying or you just stand there. So these guys had these big rifles, and they were pointing them at these kids and these other people. They didn't do anything, they just threatened them. And the teenage girls started to cry, and it was quite normal. Very upsetting situation. And so they were all taken away. Now we were very lucky, or they were actually very lucky too, because they came back just before the war. They were able to get away from whatever camp they were in. We also had a lot of night visits, and during the war we were not allowed to have our lights on at night in the house. You had to hide that from the Germans. They were not allowed to see lights in your house. And actually towards about the middle of the war, our electricity was cut off, so we just had candles and whatever we had at night, and usually the family would just go to bed early because there was no light anyway, and just get up with the sun and, so to speak, and go to bed when the sun was going down. And everybody had shutters on their house. There were like wooden doors on the outside of the windows, so we would have to close those all. And one night my father was away, my mother was there with the four of us, and there was this terrible banging on the shutters because they made an awful lot of noise and rattled. And there were, in between the little openings between the shutters and the windows, there were bright lights shining in, and here were the Germans. They wanted to come and see our house. And so they would come in. My mother would have to let them in because they would shout, "Let us in," and we could understand them fairly well because English and German is very similar, especially in the sentence construction. And that was another thing that really excited us the first time we did speak to some of these young German soldiers at my friend's farm, where they were occupying part of the building. They would speak to us, and we were able to understand them, and we would speak to them in our own language, and we thought this was fantastic that we could communicate with them. And we would come home and say to Mom, "Mom, we spoke to the Germans and we can understand them," because that was the first time in our lives that we heard anybody speak a different language, so that was very exciting. Anyway, they would come in and search the house at night, and that would mean they were usually looking for, well, money wasn't really around, but they would look for anything that had any value, any crystal or silver or anything, gold or radios or whatever you had, loudspeakers. They would just take it because you were not allowed to have any of that in the house. And they would also strip our beds. They'd say, "Get out of your bed," and they would take the blankets off and turn your mattress to see whether there were any documents hidden under the mattress maybe. And this wasn't so bad in the summer, but in the winter these houses were not heated. The only heat we had in the farm was in the kitchen, and in the living room there was a stove, and my mother always had a kettle of boiling water on there, and she would do the cooking on there as well. Like in the kitchen was a big stove, and in the living room was just a pot stove, and she always had a kettle of water standing on there. So it was very cold in the bedroom, so you can imagine in the middle of the winter you'd get out of bed and they would strip your bed and not find anything and say, "Okay, you can get back into your bed." And you were 5, 6 or 7 years old, and then you were standing, and Mom had to come and help us to make the bed because, well, we were just not used to make big beds. And that was another thing. In most families in Holland, the kids would sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, or even 4 in a double bed. Now my father always insisted we should have our own bed, so we each had our own bed, which meant that about 5 beds got stripped. Mom's bed, my sister's bed, and my bed. So there was always quite an upheaval, and then you know, everything had to be straightened out again, and the Germans would leave again. Now one night they came, and we had a lady who had been with us for quite a while, and we called her Aunt Helen. And she was about my parents' age, and she was a very nice lady, and she helped my mother a lot in the household, and she would cook and take care of us and read stories to us and whatever had to be done. And you know, she was like a second mama, and we had quite a good time with her. And she got quite sick one day, and this is another thing that never dawned on us, and my mother would say, okay, I think you better sleep tonight in the guest room, because we did have a guest bedroom in that place. In case people came over, we always had that room there available, and she had the flu and she was quite sick, so she would sleep there at night, and my mother would give her food or whatever she needed during the day. And it never dawned on us to ask, well, where does she usually sleep? It just didn't dawn on us at all. So she was caught one night because, well, they found her. They came in the house and they walked through all the rooms, and that's where she was. And so this poor sick lady had to be taken away, and well, we didn't find anything out at night too much. We knew that the Germans had been there and they'd checked our beds, and Mom had made them, but we never thought about it, that anything would have happened to Aunt Helen. And so Aunt Helen was taken away, and she never came back, so that was a very sad situation. Now we had some other neighbors. They had a small farm, and one of the girls I played with a lot, and her folks were very religious. They did a lot of praying, and they went twice to church on Sundays. They were Dutch Reformed. They were very nice people, and they had quite a few kids. They had about 5 kids there. And this girl I played with, she was the youngest. And one day the planes came over, and I had one sister a year older than I am, and she absolutely went hysterical. If a plane came over, she would holler and scream and, you know, carry on. It was just awful, but she was just so frightened of planes. And we knew that the neighbors always went into their basement if there was, if planes were coming over. Because there was always a threat of that they would throw bombs around, and they figured they would be safe in their basement. However, my father didn't believe in that, because we also had not really a basement, but we had a place that was a little, just a few steps lower than our house, and that's where my mother kept all her preserves and things. And now those people then used that place as their basement, and they would have an axe in there, and they had shovels in there, so in case a bomb would fall on the house, that they could dig themselves out. And my father always said, don't go there, because that's not safe, because if a bomb falls on the house is going to be completely in pieces, and you won't be able to get out from underneath the rubble. So anyway, this one day, my sister still would go there if the planes came over during the day. So one day I decided to go with her, and we ended up in this basement. And my friend was a year younger than I am, and she was about 6 or 7. And we were sitting in the basement, and we could hear all these planes coming over, and this girl's mom was sitting there, and a few brothers and sisters who were around. And all of a sudden she said, "Oh Lord, that I may die." And I mean, she was only 6 or 7 years old, and I never forget that. That really made impression on me, that a little girl would say that. So that was quite an event. Then the food situation was not bad, as we lived among the farmers. I had a brother. He was born in November 1943, and that was another thing. So I was 7 years old, and I didn't know my mother was going to get a baby, because she hadn't told anybody, and she was quite a stout woman, and so we never noticed anything different, you know. So one morning at 4:30 I heard his crying, and I knew that we had a cousin a few months before that, and I thought that my uncle and aunt had come over with this baby cousin to visit us. So I ran out of bed, went to Mom and Dad's room, and Dad was home, and I said, "Are Aunt and Uncle visiting here? Because I hear the baby cry. I hear my little cousin cry." And he said, "No, you got a baby brother. So that was a real shock. I mean, it was exciting, but nobody seemed to know. So anyway, so he was born during the war, and things were starting to get scarce because people from the cities came and went to the farms, and the people didn't have money, but they had maybe nice shirts or so, and they would give that, and then instead of that they would maybe get a few liters of milk or get some eggs or butter or whatever the farmers had. So my brother, as he was small, he of course needed his milk and his porridge and all this kind of stuff, so we were always able to get some food there. So we were pretty lucky. We also, the food started to get so scarce towards the end that my mother had peas from the garden, and she had dried them, and she would grind them in a coffee grinder, and she would put them in the pan, and she put a little bit of whatever she had, some grease or so with it, and she'd fry it, and she'd put a little bit of salt on it, and this is what we would have on our sandwiches, and we called that peanut butter sandwiches, and we thought that was just delicious. That was a real treat. Now, before all this part started that we didn't really have enough to eat, my mother was still able to get enough food, and as Mom and Dad grew a lot of vegetables in the yard, and she did a lot of preserving, she usually had enough vegetables and potatoes, but meat that just wasn't around anymore. So we basically lived on some bread that was available here or there, and some potatoes and vegetables, and meat and stuff and eggs that was hardly around. So also when you're that young, you get used to that, and you're happy that you get something to eat. Now we had people coming over the big highway. They would come from Amsterdam or from any old place, and especially in the winter of 1943-44, it was a very severe winter, and a lot of people came from the cities, and they came and went up north. They usually had a cart, sometimes had some of their kids on there, and they would come and try and get potatoes instead of things they had to give to these farmers, potatoes and whatever they could get hold of. And for a long time my mother would cook a big galvanized tub with potatoes and vegetables, whatever was available from her preserves, and she would mash it all, and this is what we would get to eat. So there was this big tub, and lots of people would come around and get food. Some of them would go on more up north where there were more farms and where there were lots of potatoes, and I mean that was their main aim in life, to survive, to have a place where it wouldn't be so cold, where they could sleep, and something to eat. And we had many families maybe spend just a night and then continue the next day, and quite often we had families with little ones, babies, kids a year old, and they would come, and so it was like a big, what would I say, like a big halfway house, our place. But I think when you're as young as I was, you know, you don't really question too much, and you just take it all in your stride and you adjust to it, and it was kind of exciting because we met kids there. Some of them were even our age, and you know, we would just play games with them or whatever was available. I mean, radio wasn't around, and of course there was no TV, so our entertainment was quite different from the entertainment these days. We did games, and of course if we were outside we played hide and seek and all this kind of stuff, and we played house and the whole works. Now towards the end of the war, it was about 8 or 9 months before the war, my father got caught, and as he was away a lot anyway, my mother just got word of that he was picked up with some other guys, and they were sent to a place that was called Amersfoort, and that was about 40 kilometers away from our house. And that was not a concentration camp, they just called it a work camp, and my father had to dig trenches there and do all kinds of heavy work. Now my father is a very small man, he's never been very tall, and he's very thin. And of course during the war he was even thinner because he worked hard, had a lot of worries trying to, with his friends, to keep all these Jewish people, they try to keep them safe. So, and then of course not sufficient food, and so he was really a thin man, and he always has had knee troubles. So he told them in that camp that he really couldn't dig trenches because he had bad knees, and it was just too much for him. So he had heard, because it is amazing how people will communicate. You can't communicate by phone. You can't just drive over, because there were hardly any cars really, and my parents never had a car. My dad, all he had was a bike. But there were some people there who had word of it, that he was picked up and in this work camp, and they were the ones who told Mom, and they said they had heard about a place or some people there. They got out of this camp because they get a special ticket, and that meant that they could get out because they weren't physically fit to work in the work camp. And they managed to get this to my dad. Now he was away, I believe, for a couple of months, and then one day some guy came and told Mom that my father would be getting out the day tomorrow or the day after, and that she could go and pick him up if she wanted to. So she left us all alone, because by that time, that close before the war, we didn't have any Jewish people around anymore. It's not that they were all taken away, but they moved on, and Mom was alone, and part of Holland, the south of Holland, was already liberated. That was September 44. The south of Holland was already liberated, while we were still occupied by the Germans, and we were still, you know, hungry, and we still had the Germans around and everything. But anyway, my mother left us all alone in the house, and my older sister was then about, she must have been about 10 or 11. And she was left with us. She had to take care of us and make sure that we got our food and whatever and this sort of thing. And my mother went on the bike early in the morning to pick up my father. Now that was 40 kilometers on the bike. During the war, I don't know whether you realize, but when there's a war, everything sort of comes to a halt. Like industry goes, the stores are empty, there's no food supplies, there's no new tires to put on your bike if you need new tires. And this was really the main means of transportation for us, was the bike. So the tires were gone, and there were just the frames. And to cover the frames, my dad had put little wooden sleds all around. And you could go on the bike then, but it was very rough, and it was very noisy too. So on that kind of a bike, my mother biked to Amersfoort to pick up my dad. And Dad came back on the bike with Mom sitting behind him, because in Holland you see that a lot. If you ever go there, you will see kids on the bike, but besides the one who rides the bike, there's one sitting on the back, and it has a special seat you can sit on. It's like a luggage rack, but you sit on that, and that in Holland is allowed. You can sit on that and just bike around. And so that's the way. The next day my mother came back with my father on this bike. And of course we were all so happy that he was back. That was just wonderful. And then it was April 45 and we were liberated. And I remember when we were told that we were going to be liberated soon, that the Canadians would come in, and the English and the Americans, and then everything, you know, would be over, and the Germans had pulled back and they got them all out. And of course there was a lot of damage done in Holland. A big city, Rotterdam, a big harbor city, was pretty well flat. A lot of people died during the war, not just because of damage to their houses or bombs or anything falling on them, but basically because they had no food to eat, and especially the old people and young children. Many of them died. But anyway, that glorious morning, it was a beautiful day, and it was someday in April, I remember, and the crocuses were out, and we had a lot of blossoms on the trees, and it was just a beautiful day. And there we hear these jeeps coming. And here were the Canadians in the jeeps, and they came to just greet us, and they brought big tins with biscuits, they brought bacon, they brought eggs, they brought chocolate bars, and all that kind of thing we had not really seen for the last few years. And they had white bread, and we hadn't seen white bread for ages, because whatever bread we had was the very dark rye bread or pumpernickel, and that's basically what we ate, which is all right. But this was so exciting. So they made us a breakfast, and they had this little stove. They call it a primus, and you just pump it a little and bring a match to it, and there things were going, and they were frying eggs for us, and they gave us bread and chocolate. And so we were so excited that we ate so much that we got sick on our stomachs from all the food. It was just too much. But anyway, then from then on they went more north, and so by May the 5th, 45, the whole country was liberated. And I tell you, that was a real treat. We were never allowed to wear orange, and so we could wear orange because the royal families from the House of Orange, and we used to wear that, but of course during the war we weren't allowed to see that. Now I forgot to tell something, I have to backtrack. One day, and that was just before the end of the war, now a lot of people had bombs falling near their houses, and the impact of a bomb makes the house shake, and the windows will just shatter, and that's the end of your windows. So a lot of people had, we called them emergency windows, and they were just carton boards, and they had little peek holes in them, and they were covered with glass because there was no glass available. And so people would make windows from little pieces of glass that were left, and they would put them in these carton boards, and they had a little circle, so in the circles then they would have these pieces of glass, and that's the way you had light coming into your house. Now, and Mom and Dad had said several times that we had been so lucky that we were still having all our big windows in the house. Well, this one Saturday, on Saturday afternoons we all used to have our bath. And that was another thing, we had no running water in that farm. So my mother had a special tub, and all of us would go in the tub in the kitchen, and one after the other, and then after a few washings they would have enough water heated on the stove that we could get fresh clean water from the pump, and then hot water added, and the next one would be washed. So that was always a big treat. And I remember that my sister and I were sitting together in this tub, and we were singing away, and all the nonsense carrying on when you were a little girl. And all of a sudden we heard planes, and Mom said, well, you have to get out of the tub fast. So we got out of the tub, she threw a towel over us, we went in the hall, and there was this rack with the coats, and we got a coat over the towel, and we were standing there till the noise had stopped, and we heard this tremendous shake, and that shattered all our windows. My younger brother, who was about 15 months old, he was the one who was born during the war, he was standing outside in the playpen in front of the house. There were all these big windows, and he was just looking around and was wondering what was going on. 2 bombs had fallen in the front of our house towards the end of the front property, which was quite big, and it had shattered the windows. So he was standing in glass all around him, and I guess he was so stunned, he just stood there, he didn't even cry. And my mother suddenly realized, she said, oh, Michael is outside. So she ran out and got him. He wasn't harmed, so that was all okay. Now, one piece of the bomb had gone through the window and ended up on the kitchen table, and my birthday was in March, and I'd had from an aunt and uncles, they gave me a beautiful plate and a cup and a saucer. That was for my birthday. They called it a déjeuner, and I was very happy with that. And this piece of bomb fell on that set, so that was broken. I was pretty upset about that. And then there was a hole in the wall because this thing had gone right through the wall. And so we were in a real mess. And then of course, we had to get these emergency windows too, but that was only then for a very short while, because then, of course, liberation came. But it took about 3 or 4 years before we got windows again, before things started picking up, before the stores started getting food supplies again, and industry started up again, and that people could start selling bikes and whatever, clothes. So it was really something. But as I say, I just tell you this because this is the way I experienced this whole event in my life. I think I was too young to really be too scared what was going on, but I think my mother was pretty scared. And I know that this hysterical sister I had, if she ever heard planes or anything at night, she was always the first one to run to my mother's bed and crawl in my mom's bed. Now, we would usually stay in our beds, but she would just go there because she was so afraid. So she was pretty excited when the war was over, and I think she wasn't really sure. She would still keep saying, "Are the Germans going to come back?" And my mother would say, "No, they're not going to come back. Everything is peace now. Everything is okay now." So it took her quite a while to get over that. Now, there was one thing that my mother always said was, all these young German people that had to come and fight in her country, she had met some of them too, because some of them would come around, walk around her house, and to us kids, they would talk and they would give us bread or whatever they had. And my mother was kind of afraid. She always said, you should be very polite to them and don't aggravate them, and you shouldn't really accept things from them. But we would say, "But Mommy, they want to give it to us, and it's nice because we can eat this." Yeah, but But one thing I remember once at the table, she said, "It's really too bad that these German boys had to fight." She says, "They're all people too, and I really feel that some of these kids, I really feel sorry for them because they were very young. They were maybe 20 or maybe even younger, and they had to go to war. That was their rule there. Every young male had to go to war and fight. And some of these people were really nice. I mean, we had laughs with them, we chatted with them as far as we could communicate with them, as I say, because of the difference in language, of course. Now, my father, apparently, they're going to give him some award, and there's something he was supposed to get from the Israel government for all the work he's done with his friends. Now, last February we were in Holland because my parents were married 55 years. And there were also some of the Jewish friends there who we know from the war, and they survived, and they were there too. And I asked my father, I said, "I hear you're going to get this award," and he said, "Yes." He said, "I know, but I don't really want it." And then I also heard that they have put up a monument for some of these people, and they've put their names on it who were very involved in saving Jews and so on, and they want to put his name on it. He said, "You have to wait till I am dead because I don't want it now." No nonsense, he said. "This is not what I did it for." So he's 81 now, and he's just a little tough little guy, and my mother's 79. And we had this party in February, and it was really a lot of fun, and it was really nice to meet some of the Jewish friends and other relatives. And it's a funny thing. I had never really talked about the war, not even to my children. I mean, I've told them a story in the meantime that I have told here in the school, because it's about 5 years ago that I came to this school, and there was a teacher here who was very interested. When she heard I was from Holland, she wanted to know whether I knew anything about the war, so I said, "Oh yeah, I was so young. I just know I can tell you a few stories." And she said, "Will you talk to my class?" So over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been talking to the different classes. Then, a few years ago, I told my kids, as I am always talking to these classes, I think I should tell you a little bit about the war too. But it's funny, my parents never said much about the war. I think what they had gone through, that was enough for them, and they just wanted to close the book on it, you know, and I think that's still the way they feel about it. But I have told them there, though, that I talk here in the school and, you know, just add a little bit to their program. So, are there any questions? Oh, Roy.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Mullally for sharing with us the personal experiences that she had and her family had. I mentioned that it was her father that was greatly involved, and I failed to mention that her mother was equally involved. I mean, they were a team in raising the family and saving the Jews. So both of them have to really receive this acknowledgement of their courage and their great love. So I'd like to thank Mrs. Mullally on behalf of you for them. And for them.
Hi guys, back to class.
Don't know anybody.